So I wanted to start sharing a little bit about some of my abilities, and I have never talked about any of these things in public or recorded myself discussing my medical intuitive abilities and what they are and when it started. So I'm going to start being more brave and discussing some of my abilities and how those came about and how I didn't even know some of the things that were happening to me were psychic or intuitive abilities until I was much older, in my 40s. And when I was younger, I was treated badly for some of those abilities, and I blocked them out when I was younger because I was looked at so negatively for the things that I was receiving. And so I can always remember as a child just knowing things and being able to make things happen, and knowing things about other people, sensing their feelings, or sensing what they were thinking. And I just thought everybody was like that. I didn't know that wasn't a thing. But I want to talk specifically about my second level placement at a prestigious hospital in Michigan. I was doing my second level clinical as an occupational therapist. That I want to talk about specifically because during that clinical is when I feel when I look back, is when I turn my giftings off because of how I was treated, and the level of stress that was required at that specific facility was so intense that I was developing severe anxiety. But when I look back now, I'm realizing my anxiety was actually and feeling the pain and discomfort that the patients were feeling, and I didn't understand that that was clairsentience. And I also had a lot of visions and clairvoyant activity, and also claircognizant activity too, but I didn't realize that that's what was happening. So I remember very specifically, I was in a trauma burn. I did trauma burn, which was awful. And gosh, I feel I almost needed therapy after I was in. It takes a really strong person to do those jobs every day, and I give so much gratitude to the nurses and the doctors and things like that that deal with those issues every day. I did acute spinal cord, acute brain injury, and trauma burn. I also did NICU, neonatal intensive care, and pediatric intensive care, and I witnessed probably the worst of the worst things. It was a teaching hospital, and some of the diagnoses and things that we saw were brought there because there was no other option for those patients. And so we just saw very, very difficult patients. There was lots of burn patients. I saw people that were burnt on 90% of their body that were kept alive. And so seeing those things, people hear about them, but actually to experience it and hear those things and see those things was something that I was not prepared for. I was 22 years old, and this was my first experience actually physically touching patients. My previous clinical, there was very little patient contact where I was actually physically touching people. I was doing more cognitive and behavioral type rehab, and there wasn't a lot of physical patient contact. So when I actually started touching people is when my gifts and abilities really started coming online, but I didn't know at the time that that's what was happening. So I was working the very first time I experienced something I would say different that I had to ask my clinical instructor about. I was working with this gentleman who had a crush injury to one side of his body from a fall accident, and he had a neck brace on, a TLSO, which is a back brace that keeps the body completely from any sort of movement, because he had spinal fractures, and also he had an external fixator on his arm. So his entire arm was encased by metal rings that were screwed down into his bones to hold his arm together. And it was my job to do retrograde and lymphatic massage on his arm because his arm was extremely swollen, and there was a lot of vascular damage, and obviously bone damage and muscular damage as well. And he had this metal external fixator on his arm. So my clinical instructor had told me she wanted me to work on massaging his arm and help with blood flow and get the swelling down so that it could promote healing. And I remember very distinctly, when I worked with this individual, when I would work with him, I felt a profound sadness, and I felt my body felt really heavy, like I was being pushed down, and I felt very my brain felt very depressed, and I felt I could sense what he was feeling. Obviously, he'd been through a massive trauma, and I felt so much empathy for him that it was almost overwhelming. So I was very overwhelmed, and I was also very nervous to do what I was doing anyway. So there was my feelings, and then I was feeling his feelings. And I remember the very first time I touched him. First of all, when I touched him, I got a strong vision in my head. I was told, and when I read his chart, that he had a fall injury from a building, that he was working in that he was in a garage, a multi-layered garage, and he fell from this garage. And so when I touched him, I got this very, very strong image of him jumping from the garage. So I didn't feel like he fell. I felt like he had attempted suicide, because when I saw him jump, I felt now in my brain, I could see it happening like through his eyes. And I felt like an extreme sense of panic, like, oh my God, I can't believe I did this. This was a mistake. This was a mistake. And then boom. And so I felt that. I felt like a strong, like, emotional overwhelm, and the panic and the being free. And like, I can even picture it now, like as we're speaking, I can still, and this was over 20 years ago, and I can still see him. I can see the accident. Not the accident. I can see him trying to commit suicide. And he obviously survived his injuries. And so I talked to my clinical instructor, and also, let me backtrack too. When I touched him, when I was doing this retrograde massage on him, I could feel my hands felt like lightning, like buzzing, coming out of my fingertips on his arm. And like I said, I hadn't had a lot of physical contact with patients, so I didn't know that was like weird. Okay, so I talked to my clinical instructor, and I said, it was very intimidating clinical. And I said to her, I said, do your hands buzz when you touch your patients? And she looked at me, the way that she looked at me, like I was crazy. And then I also brought up that I felt like we should be addressing his mental health, because I felt like he did not fall. And she became so angry at me for assuming that he had tried to commit suicide. And I felt like it was a huge thing, because I could feel that this huge sense of sadness on him. So that was the beginning of me turning my gifts off. And it took me till I was in my 40s. So this was my early 20s. I was probably 22, 23. And it took till my late 30s, early 40s, till I started to realize that when I'm touching people and that when I'm seeing these things, it was actually giftings.